And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Well, I guess this is International Day. Our first hour was about what's going on in Greece, and I think that's very, very consequential. I think it's going to alter the fate and future of Europe if Syriza does what they say they're going to do. Meanwhile, the situation in Ukraine and with regard to the United States' relationship with Russia seems to be hitting a rough patch. And so I wanted to get our old friend, Professor Stephen Cohen, back on, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines the new Cold War, is now available in paperback. And the website for The Nation magazine, of course, is thenation.com. Professor Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
It's great having you with us.
The only problem is I don't think it's a rough patch. It's a kind of abyss in American-Russian relations at the moment. And another footnote, I think what's happened in Greece and what's happening in Ukraine are related, but we can talk about that later.
Whoa. Well, can we start with that? You totally piqued my interest.
Well, this is kind of jumping over the detail, but Europe, the European Union, is deeply divided politically about what to do about the Ukrainian crisis. Washington is determined to strike at Russia, short of militarily, but maybe that too, as hard as possible, talking about new economic sanctions. Europe is divided, and about half of Europe wants the sanctions to end against Russia, partly because they're having an economic blowback in Europe. The austerity program, which is now under attack as a result of the Greek elections, is bringing pressure in particular on Germany, which for now remains the political leader of Europe. So how much longer Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, can hold out against, for example, France and Italy and Hungary and Romania and maybe Bulgaria and some of the other European countries in wanting to end the confrontation with Russia through diplomacy isn't clear. But excuse me, I've got a cold. The worse the crisis or political challenge to the austerity program in Europe, which comes from Germany, the more Europe divides, and the more it divides in regard to what to do about Russia, because that too is an economic burden.
So if Syriza pulls out of the euro and possibly even out of the European Union altogether, but if they just go halfway and become like the United Kingdom, in other words, recover their own currency, the drachma, how does that change the dynamic between Russia and Western Europe and Russia and the United States? Or does it not?
Well, there are a number of perspectives here. Let's take the most long-term perspective. Let's say, excuse me,
it's quite all right,
that Greece even threatens to leave the European Union. In May, I think, this issue will be on the ballot in the United Kingdom. Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, seems to be willing to take the UK out of the European Union. What would that do? Well, it would diminish the European Union economically and politically, but it would make Germany the undisputable leader of Europe. The United Kingdom would then embrace, in a kind of Tony Blair-like way, as it did during the Iraq War, and as Cameron is embracing Obama today over Ukraine, it would make the United Kingdom flee to the United States politically, leaving Europe to Germany. Germany is divided almost down the middle in regard to Russia. And as the economic burdens of Europe grow, the euro has fallen almost a flat equal to the dollar, dramatic fall. The economic pressure for a settlement with Russia through diplomacy rather than war will grow, leaving the United States either on the sidelines or as the spoiler. Now that's the long term. In short term, the trend will be apparent to all politicians in Europe.
That's fascinating. To what extent do you think that this may play into, and then I want to get into the whole, United States, Russia, Ukraine thing, but to what extent do you think that this might play into this Archduke Ferdinand scenario that you and I have discussed a number of times, where you've got some stressor, some unanticipated event that just causes the dominoes to crash, and you end up with World War III, whether it's a shooting war, an economic war, or just another Great Depression. Your thoughts?
I don't feel competent to talk about the possibility of a Great Depression. But in the United States, where outwardly the stock market, for example, seems to be flourishing, that seems to me to be rather hollow. We're very happy about the fall in oil prices, but it's going to rack a lot of countries with which we are, in this cliche but meaningful term, globalization, linked. So whether there'll be an immediate or long-term blowback from the economic downturn in Russia, in Europe, possibly in China, because oil glues these economies together in a profound way, I don't know. But we're not going to get away scot-free from the consequences of this. Politically, and that takes us to the news of today and this weekend, the renewed fighting in the Ukraine might be such a domino. I'm not a hysteric about this, but I have said since we start talking, I think, Tom, in February, that the scenario probably, unless something was done to stop it, would unfold as follows. A political dispute in Ukraine becomes a Ukrainian civil war. That's happened. The two sides in the Civil War would align themselves with Washington or the West and with Russia, and therefore it would become a proxy war. We are there today. The proxy war could lead us to a Cuban Missile Crisis situation. All right, where are we today? The fighting in Ukraine, and I think for political reasons, Washington is claiming Russia and the rebels renewed it, but that's not so clear. But in any event, they're fighting again and more fiercely, and in yet another city in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, a big city, a very important city. Now we get reports confirmed that an American general, I don't remember his name, I want to say Benjamin or Ben Hodges, not sure, has arrived in that area in Ukraine to train what they call the National Guard. This is in effect these battalions, often extremely right-wing, some would say neo-fascist, I won't say that, but there is that suspicion, fighting against the Russian-backed rebels in the eastern Ukraine. Now we get, yesterday, video reports that seem to indicate, by the voices speaking, Americans fighting with the Ukrainian forces. So let's say that this is true, and let's say an American is killed by somebody, a sniper, by his own troops, Ukrainian troops, in Ukraine. That's the kind of tripwire with NATO, the United States, and Russia, not quite eyeball to eyeball, but let's say within shouting distance militarily, in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, that could lead to this horrible scenario. And remember, it's not 1914, it's nuclear 2015. And nuclear includes all these so-called tactical nuclear weapons, as though they're not nuclear weapons, battleground nuclear weapons, that both sides have discussed in a theoretical scenario as something they might use. So I think the situation is dire, absolutely dire. Somebody's got to pull back, and soon.
Is this general on active duty, or is he a retired general?
I think he's assigned to NATO, but I fact-checked things. I read this. I didn't fact-check it. Of course, the New York Times and the Washington Post report almost none of this. So, I mean, I think you can find him online. I'm just not sure.
I'll have to track that down. We'll be back. Can you stick around?
I've got no place to go. A snowstorm.
Okay, great. Professor Stephen Cohen is with us. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
You can read Professor Cohen's most recent piece in Reuters, Stop the Pointless Demonization of Putin. That was May 2012. Welcome back, Professor Cohen. Sorry to plug a two and a half year old article, but it's absolutely apropos today. To stop the pointless demonization of Putin.
It's an oldie but a goodie.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I thought you had just recently read it when I read it, and then I, as soon as I saw the date, I thought, oh, we talked about this a year ago. It's or thereabouts, maybe a half a year ago. So, where over the course of this last year that we've been talking about this, how much has changed in Ukraine?
In Ukraine or in American-Russian relations?
Well, all of the above.
All right. In Ukraine, a rather extreme government or regime has come to power in Kiev because the elected president was overthrown back in February. Its ideology is very extreme Ukrainian nationalism, which has always been part of Ukraine, but located mainly in the western provinces, not the eastern, which are pro-Russian, Russian-speaking at least, but an extreme nationalism that was moderated by elections and compromises and coalitions during the 20 years since the end of the Soviet Union. With the defection or the departure or the ousting, depending on how we interpret the events of 2014, of the eastern provinces, the electoral base of Ukraine is now what's called pro-Western. But that pro-Westernism, Tom, if you look at it carefully, does not include unanimous or maybe even majority support for Western values. There's a lot of anti-democratic impulses in that coalition that rules Ukraine now. There's very anti-gay attitudes, very traditional attitudes. A lot of the attitudes that we ascribe to Putin are widespread in Ukraine because this is part of the same history and culture. So you've got this regime, this government in Kiev, backed 100% by Washington. Vice President Biden seems to be running this policy, if we can call it a policy. We're arming them. The government in Kiev is on the verge of economic collapse. George Soros, I think for his own reasons, is urging that immediately the West give them $50 billion. But they can't raise the $15 billion. They need to get to pay their debts this year. So they may default, and everybody knows what default means. Meanwhile, the 4 or 5 million people of Ukraine who live in the eastern provinces or the Donbass, their economy has been ruined by bombardment by Kiev, or near ruin. That's the coal mines, the railway lines, the steel industry, because that's the area that's Ukraine's industrial base. So the country is somewhere between ruin and collapse, politically and economically. I'm not sure if we speak a year from now that there will be a Ukraine. Fragments may have scattered and gone elsewhere. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But that's the situation today. And meanwhile, the war escalates.
We'll continue this conversation in just a moment. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, thenation.com, and Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, is now available in paperback. We'll be right back. thenation.com. 20 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. Thenation.com, his new book, or his book, it's out in paperback, The New Cold War. The title of the book, which examines the new Cold War, is Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, and now available in paperback. Professor Cohen, we started out our conversation preparing to talk about the relationship between the United States and Russia, and sub to that, the relationship between President Putin and President Obama. And we kind of wandered off into Greece and Ukraine, and I'd like to get back to that for a moment, if we could. What are your thoughts on where we're at right now, and why I see this Well, for example, last Friday I did a little piece on my TV show on RT about this because I was just astonished that the new director of the Broadcasting Board of Governors said we've got some real problem with Boko Haram and ISIS and Russia Today, and I'm like, what? And I called up Blanquita Cullum, who's an old friend of mine and was 8 years on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and she said, news is not terrorism. This was, this is words to the effect of, that was not the right thing for him to say,
No.
which I agree with. And I just, I did this little personal piece last week, even though I have no obligation to or whatever. I pretty much, not pretty much, I 100% run my own show. But it's like increasingly I'm seeing these things pop out, this piece about Russia's propaganda machine and all this stuff. It's almost like there's a campaign going on.
There is a campaign going on. So let's start with that. And then maybe if we have time, get back to the situation that's unfolding in Ukraine
Sure.
right now. Shall we do that?
Sure.
What Andrew Lack said, equating Russian Today, a kind of voice of America of Russia, but somewhat more expansive and diversified in its own way, with independent shows such as yours on it.
And Larry King.
And Larry King. And I would say Stephen Cohen, myself. I appear occasionally, not very often. But I speak only for myself. And I've been told, by the way, that they have more viewers in hotel rooms around the world than any other international network. And I think to myself, why not speak to all those American travelers who are sitting in a hotel room someplace in Europe?
I've been astonished by the amount of feedback I've gotten from friends and family who have been traveling around the world and said,
Right.
"Hey, I watched your show in my hotel room."
I think that's what's alarming the American government. But let's get to the point. What Lack said, equating Russia Today or RT, the network, with ISIS, for example, as a great threat in the world, as though RT television chops off people's heads on video, is preposterous. But it came directly from President Obama. You might have blinked. You might have covered another story that day. But when he addressed the United Nations Assembly a few weeks ago, he made that equation that the world faces three great threats, ISIS, RT, and the other one you mentioned.
Boko Haram.
Yeah, and so Lack is just echoing his boss.
Wow.
I mean, that's all it is. And so if people sometimes say, well, on RT, we hear the voice of Putin, for example. Not sure how often we do sometimes. What Lack spoke with was the voice of his boss, President Obama. We know these stations are funded by the government, so let's grow up. We're old enough to decide for ourselves what's useful information and what's isn't. But how did Obama come to make this equation? And I've been warning about this since about 2002, that a gradual vilification of Putin in the American media in particular spread to Europe, but it's nowhere near as widespread or unchallenged in Europe as it is in the United States, has resulted, even before the Ukrainian crisis, into the full-scale demonization of Putin in America. In my lifetime in Soviet studies, I do not recall any Soviet or Russian leader being so personally vilified by the American media, and still more by the President of the United States himself, who Obama's spoken in this vein about Putin, or would-be presidents, including Mrs. Clinton, who's equated Putin with Hitler. Now, how in the world she thinks that if she becomes president of the United States, that's going to help her negotiations with Putin, I don't know. Somebody in her circle apparently can't connect dots. But this is a very serious phenomenon. It's become a kind of institution of its own, the demonization of Putin. So much so that Henry Kissinger, not a radical speaking man, wrote in the Washington Post back in March, excuse me, that the demonization of Putin is not a policy. It's an alibi for not having a policy. That's Kissinger, not me. Wow. That is very profound, because what Kissinger saw and warned about is we don't really have a policy toward Russia, a rational policy, because this demonization of Putin has gotten in the way. And it's so bad today in 2015 that no American politician can be seen to be advocating any kind of even-handed negotiations with Putin. And I will give you an example. A few weeks ago in the Washington Post, there appeared an article by a couple guys at the Brookings Institution, hardly a more centrist place, suggesting that an accommodation with Russia would include a guarantee that Ukraine would never become a member of NATO. And since the expansion of NATO is what's driven this crisis anyway, that of course is true. Ukraine, to be stable, has not to be in any military alliance. The authors quoted Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger as people who had proposed that solution. And a letter writer to the Washington Post, mind you, not a crackpot, but a former American ambassador to Ukraine, accused Kissinger and Brzezinski of appeasement.
Wow.
So it's how this demonization of Putin has corrupted and polluted and narrowed discourse in America about the crisis. And that's one of those tripwires that you mentioned that lead to war. We can't have
Would you like to stick around and discuss Ukraine, or do you think we've covered it?
I think there's something to be said about what's going on today.
Okay, stick. If you can hang on for
You're
hang on just a
listening
second.
to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
We have a 5-minute newscast at the bottom of the hour, and then we'll be back. Professor Cohen, you'll be with us?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Thanks. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. 28 minutes before the hour. It is not the greatest for the knockdown, drag-out fireworks and all that kind of thing, but I think that these are some of the most important issues of our day. Our first hour talking about what's going on with Greece and what's the future of the European Union, which will affect us and the way that we live and what's going on in our future. And in this hour, our conversation with Professor Stephen Cohen, the author of Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines the new Cold War, contributing editor to The Nation, thenation.com, and professor emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, about the nature of our relationship, our being the United States, our relationship with Russia and President Obama's relationship with President Putin, and the situation in Ukraine. I think we've covered most of the former stuff, and we were going to come back and get to Ukraine. Professor Cohen, you're still with us?
I am.
Great. Okay, so you want to start at the beginning and just kind of give us a quick recap and then bring us up to where we're at now?
Well, I think most of your folks know we talked about the prehistory, but I think it's important to focus on what's happened since the middle of last week and over the weekend. Is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
So if you were paying attention, or if the papers reported it or the TV, a number of European leaders last week, particularly the president of France, Hollande, said publicly that Putin had been misrepresented in the West. He was not aggressing toward Ukraine or Europe in the sense of seeking territory, that he had legitimate security interests. And that accord signed back in September involving the West, Russia, and the opposing sides in Ukraine, called the Minsk Accords, which included a ceasefire. It had other elements. That if that ceasefire, which had been challenged for 4 or 5 months, would now hold, meaning last weekend, Europe should move to end the sanctions on Russia. That was an astonishingly bold statement. What happened? Someone restarted the fighting at an escalated level late last week. And over the weekend, through Saturday, through Sunday, yesterday, and even today, the fighting has shifted to yet another city in eastern Ukraine, and the ceasefire clearly no longer exists. And therefore, no longer in play is the moderate, let's say, or accommodationist part of Europe that wants this to end through negotiations with Russia. Now, the version we are told in the United States is that it was the Russian-backed rebels who broke radically the ceasefire with fighting around the Donetsk airport and then doing X, Y, Z. The Russians are saying that's not true. that Kiev escalated the war by shelling these civilian cities again, and all the rebels did was attack to drive Kiev's artillery back away from the cities. Being as we don't have any American correspondents in that region, war correspondents, telling us through his or her own eyes what's going on, we have to sort this out. And
why the hell don't we? Pardon my interrupting, but why hasn't any American news network sent a correspondent to that region?
Occasionally, to be fair, the New York Times and the Washington Post, I don't follow the other papers, do send one of their reporters into Donbass. Usually the headline would be Donetsk, which is the main city there, or Lugansk, or another one of those eastern cities. But overwhelmingly, the New York Times and the Washington Post, report this story with a Moscow, because that's where their bureaus are. What do you call it? It says where the reporter is.
Right.
But the point is,
byline.
Byline, yeah. Overwhelmingly, these American reporters are basing these stories on news handouts by the military authorities in Kiev. In Kiev. Now, occasionally they will say they aren't verified, but the lead paragraph says that Russian-backed rebels did this horrible thing, according to military spokesman in Kiev. And then later in the story, you read, this isn't verified. If it's not verified, it shouldn't be reported in the first place, and certainly not in the lead paragraph, and certainly not in the headlines. Right. So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, you'd have to take that up with the newspapers.
When did President Hollande of France say that we should stop the sanctions against Russia? I mean, I follow this fairly carefully, and I totally missed that.
Well, he's been taking, let's call it the softer, dovish position all along. His position in France, of course, was weak to begin with. He had very little popular support. And then came the terrorist attack on the French magazine. He was distracted by that. But it was just before the attack on the French magazine that he made this bold statement that the sanctions should be either curtailed or removed if the ceasefire held. Now, why would he have said it at that time? Because according to I don't think it was legislation, but the decisions made to impose sanctions on Russia, they end in the summer, this coming summer, unless renewed. And they were scheduled to be reviewed in this March. So that intensified focus on the sanctions and a need for Europe to make up its mind. But note one thing, Tom. Note one thing. Hollande and the others are talking about the European sanctions. They can't control the American sanctions. And Obama has said, and his spokespeople have said, that we intend not to remove our sanctions, almost no matter what, but to escalate our sanctions. That was the statement as of this morning and last night. So here, too, you see a division. Now, if you want to if your folks want to read the newspapers cunningly, note one thing. If a person says in authority, we will end or reduce the sanctions if Russia supports the ceasefire, that's a moderate position. If a person says, we will not end the sanctions until Russia gives back Crimea, that's a declaration of war, an extreme statement, and it will never happen without war. So you can interpret where people stand by whether they're linking the sanctions to the Crimea event back in February or to the war in eastern Ukraine, which reasonably should end through a ceasefire and negotiations begin. Now, that leaves aside who's been violating the ceasefire. And I would leave you just one thought, because we got to be sensible here. This isn't pro-Putin. This isn't pro-Obama. This is pro-people of the eastern Ukraine. Why would the rebels bombard their own cities, Donetsk, Kramatorsk, Lugansk, where their relatives, their mothers and fathers and grandparents and children live? They are firing back from those cities, no doubt about it. But why would they bomb their own cities? It makes no sense. And there's one other thing. There's a small town not far from Donetsk, the capital, the big city, called Gorelkov, I think. It's a small town. It's about like Elizabeth, New Jersey, from Manhattan, where I lived. Somebody attacked that city with aircraft last week, bombed it. The rebels have no airplanes. Nobody has ever suggested that Russian aircraft have been involved in this war. It could only have been the Ukrainian Air Force that bombed that city. So was that reported? not in the United States. But people who were down there said they saw the planes. So, we got to think about the people there. This is a humanitarian crisis of enormous magnitude. More than 5,000 dead, 1 million displaced, women, children, the elderly trapped without minimal infrastructural services. The weather is cold and bitter. There are going to be a lot more deaths, collateral damage. Where is the right to protect doctrine that the American ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Powers, so brings out, except when it involves helping people who feel warmly toward Russia? Why has the United States done nothing to abet some kind of humanitarian relief? When the Russians sent those famous white trucks, the United States said they're full of weapons. It's not humanitarian. They opened the trucks. I don't know what else was hidden in there, but there was a lot of food and medicine and water and what people need. There should be an international rescue mission to save the people of eastern Ukraine. The indifference to those people in America, no matter what their ideology is, what language they speak, is a scandal. It's a shame. It's a blemish on the reputation of America.
To what extent might this be influenced by this $10 billion oil deal that was cut years ago with the Ukrainians, with an American oil company? I'm forgetting which one. And the fact that the apparent fact that Ukraine is sitting on oil shale, much like North Dakota does, that with fracking could make it a major oil player. We have just a minute left.
You're asking for the motivation behind an unwise American policy that's led to the worst international crisis in our time. I don't know. And when I don't know as a professor, I say I don't know. I know there's oil in Ukraine. There are other assets in Ukraine that Western investors want. There's frackable oil, if that's the right word, in eastern Ukraine. I think ExxonMobil was fracking there for a while and withdrew. But I think there are a lot of factors, including ideology, including a wish to be rid of the Putin regime in Moscow, a lot of factors, including profitability or greed, that are driving this. But whatever it is, Congress is silent, including the progressives. They all vote for these horrible resolutions. And we are in the worst international crisis of our time, and is getting worse by the week. And that's where we are today. We need somebody to speak up in the United States, talk to people who have influence with the administration, and change course. That's not capitulation or appeasement. It's good sense.
Yeah. Very well said. Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, professor emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines the new Cold War, is now available in paperback. The website for The Nation, of course, is thenation.com. Professor Cohen, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, and forgive the cold.
Oh, it's quite all right, and it's always great talking. Your voice is so great, it pushes through any kind of cold. We'll be back.